just in time.
Good.
You're welcome. Do you want one or two? Okay. My name is Trina Zeiss, and I'm with the Denton County Master Gardeners Association, which is an association led by the AgriLife Extension Office out of the Texas A&M. And I'm here to talk to you today about composting. So how many of you compost currently? One? Okay. Two? Sorta? A little bit? And y'all? Not at all?
Have in the past, but not currently.
You compost? Okay. And y'all are just looking to learn how to do it? So when someone says compost, there's lots of different things that they could be talking about. And we'll go into those different kinds of composting later on. But first we're going to talk about the essentials. You'll notice on your second slide, composting essentials. First you want to start with a container. And there's lots of different containers that you could use. Second, you want to get your ingredients mixed right. A lot of people think they can just dump in a bunch of manure and that's compost. And that's just not true. It will decompose, but you're not going to have the right balance that you're looking for to really nourish your gardens. And third, composting is low maintenance, but it is not maintenance free. Some people think you can just dump it in and walk away forever. And true in nature that will happen, but it will be a very slow process. For gardeners, you're going to have to do some simple chores to make sure that you have the best compost at your disposal. So let's talk about the container first. Your containers can be very simple or they can be very complex, very expensive. It can be as cheap as probably 50 cents or free if you've got stuff laying around, or you can go into the hundreds of dollars for your container. It just depends on what you want, what you're responsible for. Sometimes homeowners associations will dictate what kind of containers, if they can see it, what you can use. But I put a few examples here. The first examples that you'll see are stationary containers. So it can be a wired enclosure, it could be a trash can, it could be something that you make with pine. There's lots of different, it could be a pile on the ground, you just know where it is. It could be, I recommend that you put some sort of barrier around it because compost has a tendency to wander off. It's decomposing, it's going to go right back into the ground. So if you don't contain it, you're going to lose a lot of what you've worked for. Second kind of containers are rotary. And the reason that a rotary container is nice is because you need to incorporate air into your compost for it to work its best. If you don't ever turn your compost, it takes longer to decompose. If you turn it, you'll get things quicker. So your compost pile can be ready for you to use compost in as little as 2 to 3 weeks. If you don't do a thing with it, you just dump stuff there, you're looking at months. And nature is your best example. Take a look at what happens in the forest floor. Things fall and they just sit. Well, over years it decomposes and it's nice and soft and rich in nutrients. But that's over years. As gardeners, we like things to move a little faster. We have a spring garden, we have a fall garden. We want to be able to use that compost nutrients often. And then there's your setup. The next slide talks about your setup. You can see some concrete cinder blocks put up like a bed. And then you'll also see the three stacking system. So I've got two pictures. One's just divided. You just throw it in there. And then the second, they're really nice pine boxes. The equestrian, they're called the Lake Louisville Equestrian Trail Association. And they have the equestrian trails through Lake Ray Roberts all the way down to Lake Louisville. It's a 22-mile trail. They were looking to do some composting on the trail with the manure. And this is what I suggested that they use because it really looks nice in that park environment. So the reason that you would have three is in the first one you put your raw materials that hasn't had a chance to decompose yet, and then as it starts to decompose you move that to your second bin, or you just move to a second bin. So your first bin is raw, your second bin it's partially decomposed but it's not compost yet, and then your third bin is your fully composted matter that you're ready to use in your garden. And you don't have to move them, you just move yourself. Okay, that one's already started, we're going to start on this one. And that one's already going, so we're going to move to this one. And then you just watch it. And make sure you use your compost. And if you run out of space and you need that compost bin, take your active compost out of it and store it someplace where you can use it. Okay? So, compost ingredients. First you want to start with chunky materials like branches, woody stems, things that are pretty bulky because that helps you get good airflow. Then you want to fold in some garden soil because that gives it something to work with. Do you all know why compost is rich? Do you know? Let's talk about that for a second. What is it that turns our kitchen scraps or our cow manure or whatever it is into something that plants can use? Anybody? So it's bacteria. The bacteria that's eating the natural decomposition process is what's participating in this. And as that decays all of that material, it turns it into something that our plants can use. So in this process, we have lots of things that are decaying material. We have worms, we have other bugs, we have bacteria, we have mold. Some of these things we think of as bad, ooh, I don't want that, is really part of that decomposition process. And so these are all good things. But you have to help them do their job. So you want to throw in some of that rich organic garden soil because it's already got some of those bugs. You get something to work with. If you just have the rotten apple, well, if you just have an apple and there's no bacteria at all in it and you put it in a vacuum, I don't say it's not going to decompose because there's some, it couldn't be free of bacteria, but it's not going to do what you want it to do. You've got to feed it. You've got to give it the air. You have to give it the bacteria to start with, so on and so forth. Okay, then we're going to add green and brown material. And in a second, we're going to talk about the difference between those two. Remember earlier I said you can't just put all manure in there. It's not going to turn into the compost, the rich food that you want it to. Well, the same is true if you did all of hay or you pick one thing. If it was all one thing, you're not going to have balance. And you want to have balance in here. So we're going to talk about green and brown material shortly. Excuse me. And then you want to keep your compost material moist. Because bacteria like moist. They don't want something wet, but they don't like dry. If it's too dry, your compost is going to take longer to decompose. Your pile is going to take longer to decompose. If it's too wet, it'll decompose, but you're going to have a stinky mess. So you really don't want too much water. You really want to have it about the consistency of a wrung-out sponge. Pass that around. If y'all don't mind touching the same, it's a clean paper towel. I just put water on it. That's about how you want it. Yes, sir. You have a question?
Well, I just wanted to say that
There's a microphone here. Just a second. Right here.
my wife is very ill, and so she doesn't get into things like that. But down the hill down there, I was planning on playing the games with what was so nice down there. You know, the little card that we were playing in, and they were playing them. But they wouldn't let me in there, though.
Okay. Okay.
So do you do like equal amounts of those two
Yeah.
materials?
Yes.
Who knows, it could happen.
So we have green material, which are high in nitrogen, and that's really important. Then we have brown material that's high in carbon. Now here's why it's really important. Have any of you taken your campfire site and dumped it onto your garden thinking that's really going to help my garden because it's, you know, it's burnt up, it's composty kind of material? Well, if you ever have, you would have noticed that everything in your garden died because it's too hot, it's too full of carbon, doesn't have enough balance. And so the same is true with most things. When you get your chemical balance out of whack, it's too hot. You're not going to be able to sustain your garden. You need to have balance, and that's really important. And it's not one for one. If you looked at a chart, you want a little more nitrogen than carbon, and that's easily researchable, exactly what your balance needs to be. But if you just follow these guidelines, nature will work itself out. Just make sure you have a little of everything. So alfalfa, algae, green stuff. Coffee grounds, those are all green materials. Coffee grounds, easy. Take it from your kitchen and throw it out. And if you don't drink coffee, tea. And if you don't drink coffee or tea, borrow some or skip it and find something else. Grass clippings, those are all green materials. Hay is a green material. Manures are green material. So those are good sources. And then your brown materials, your ashes from wood, not from charcoal, not from any kind of coal source, but from wood. Bark, cardboard, shredded up, peanut shells, vegetable stalks, all of those kind of things. Those are your brown materials. You don't want to use coal ash. That's a item to avoid. You don't want to use colored paper because of the dyes in there. You do not want to use any diseased plants, particularly with diseases that spread easily. So there's something going through the north central Texas area called rose rosette. Are you familiar with rose rosette? So it's a disease that attacks roses, and you can identify it right now when the roses start to come out. They have kind of a witch's broom look on them. It looks like a really fast growth of rose on the end, and it's not right, and they're kind of curled and gnarly looking. It looks like maybe it bolted because we had a warm day, but really it could be rose rosette. And I would have that checked out if you suspect that you have it. What happens is if you put that in your compost pile, it survives, and then you use that in your rose bed, you just infected every other rose that you had. There's no cure for rose rosette. You just have to replace the roses. And if you compost those in some place that other people are gathering their compost from, like your city collects it, then you've spread it to the community. So it's really important that you throw that in the trash or burn it or some way dispose of it, but try not to recycle it into the garden. You don't want to put meat in there because meat attracts flies and maggots, and it's stinky and smelly. It's not a good thing you want in your compost. Ideally, your compost will not have an offensive odor. And I will show you that in just a second because I brought some worms. Worms are one way to compost very easily. So you don't want to throw weed seeds in there because you're going to put this in your garden. Do you want to grow weeds in your garden? Nah. We spend enough time weeding. We don't want to grow them. Okay, so then the last two slides are just talking about your compost use. What can you use it for? You can give it away to other gardeners if you have too much. I've never heard of anybody having too much, but it's possible. You can fill in eroded areas. The rains come. You've got pits in your turf or in your garden. You can sell it to nonprofit organizations, or you can allow nonprofit organizations to sell it to raise profits for their organization, is what I mean to say. Because they'll, especially if you have large amounts of compost, let's say the Equestrian Association we were talking about, they've raised the compost, they can bag it, they can sell it for their nonprofit association to help with the trail maintenance and things like that. So there's lots of different things you can do besides just your own yard. So that's kind of the ABCs of composting, and that's the typical throw my garden scrap or my kitchen scraps out and turn it into something beneficial. That's one system in a system stacking equation. A system stacking just means there's no waste. Everything I use is going to be put into something else that I can use, and that will be put into something else that I can use. And it all works together, so you really don't have anything that you have to throw away. That would be zero waste system stacking, which is the ultimate goal. That was just one component of it. I've eaten something, I have some sort of leftover that I couldn't eat, I'm going to throw it in my compost. If you can eat it, you can compost it. Okay, so also things you wouldn't want to put in there would be dog and cat feces, because typically what they eat is, it's got a lot of chemicals in it, and it's not good compost material. It's going to attract bad things that you don't want. It's smelly. Kind of fits in there with the whole meat thing. Just avoid that. Animals that are strictly vegetarian, that manure is good to put in your compost. So that's kind of that's the dividing line. If it eats meat, don't put it in there. If it eats vegetables, you can put it in there. Do you have a question?
If you have a dog that's eating strictly organic and you find it doesn't smell in your compost because it's kind of a closed system and you have the turn handle, my thought was, is there still an issue with the vaccines and everything that the dog is given? Does that get into your food supply?
Don't use dog fecal matter, but that's your choice. You want to do that, but the rule of thumb is just not to use it because
Right.
they're meat eaters. You wouldn't want to use human fecal matter, dog, cat fecal matter. People think you can because it's there in the yard and readily available, but the rule of thumb is don't.
Because it's dangerous? I mean, it'll put dangerous things into your compost, or just because it might attract flies and smell?
Right.
So if you control that, is it still dangerous?
I mean, dangerous is not a word that we've ever talked about,
Okay,
not ideal.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so another way to compost, besides what we just talked about with the containers, is called vermiculture. Vermiculture means worms. It means using worms to develop your compost. And if you all want to walk by here, you're welcome to. So vermiculture is using worms. Oh, look, there's one right there. Not earthworms. They're a special kind of worm. These are red wigglers. And here's one, if you can see it. And you're welcome to walk by and get a closer look. They do the same thing. They break down materials into what we can use. It's one worm. Red wigglers are readily available on the internet. They're going to be at the bottom because they don't like light. Light hurts them. I just dug one up.
Some of the garden centers around have them too for sale.
Right, and I'm thinking Marshall Grant.
Marshall Green does.
Yeah, Marshall Grant
you're
is
also
a special.
I'm going to show you. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do this. Just a
Okay.
second.
I was there a couple of days ago and their worms aren't quite ready, but
I see.
they said in a week
Doesn't
or
like
so.
the light.
Okay.
So if you wanted to do vermiculture in your yard, it's really easy. So you could get a bin similar to this one that I have right here. It's just a Rubbermaid bin. And drill some holes in the lid like this so that your worms can get oxygen. And then take some newspaper or cardboard is a good choice, and you want to cut it into 1-inch strips like this and get it moist with water, just as moist as that towel that I passed around. It's like a sponge that's been wrung out. If it's too wet, your worms will drown. If it's too dry, they won't have the moisture they need to move because their bodies are moist, and if it's too dry, it's painful. So that's their habitat, and they will decompose that over time, but it also keeps them away from light. They don't like light at all. These are different than earthworms. Earthworms can come up on the surface and they're just fine for a limited amount of time. Red wigglers will not do that. And there are other kinds of worms that you can use for vermiculture, but red wiggler seems to be one of the more popular worms. Then you want to feed your worms. And when I started this, I gave it too much food, which wasn't bad for the worms. It's just bad for my worm farm because it grew mold, which stank a little bit, but it doesn't hurt anything. Remember, I told you mold is breaking things down just like worms are and other bugs. It's just part of the process, but I didn't like it, so I backed off on how much I fed them. And you'll have to play that by ear. You'll know if you fed them enough when the material is disappearing, but you're not growing mold. You know you're not feeding them enough if the material is disappearing rapidly, and you're not getting a good worm reproduction. So each one of these worms is hermaphroditic, which means it has both male and female sexes in the worm, but you still need at least 2 worms to reproduce. So if you've got 2, you can start a farm. And they will reproduce every couple of weeks, given the right environment. So it's dark, it's moist, they have something to eat, you're going to start having reproduction every couple of weeks. And they'll lay eggs, and those will turn into little bitty worms, maybe 2 to 3 millimeters long, and they're not red at first. It takes a week for them to turn red. So that's how you know when you're doing things well. Now, to capture your compost out of here, there's several ways you can do that. You can pick this up and sift it through a strainer, and whatever falls out you can use in your garden. But I don't like to do that because remember I told you those babies are only 2 to 3 millimeters long? They fall through the strainer, and I was losing babies. And I didn't want to do that. So I have another process, and that is, so I made my newspaper into a donut right in the center of my farm. And I put the food right in the center of the donut to get things started. Then, when I thought, there's enough material in here, I want to start collecting it, I put the food on one side. And all the worms scoot over to the food. And I could collect all of the droppings out of the middle. Now, the droppings, I'm going to pull some out for you right here. This is the droppings. This is what you're going to use in your compost. I hate to have you get up again, but I'm on camera. So if I leave the spot, I'll be off camera. So if y'all want to come up and smell this, you'll smell it does not stink. Like you would think rotten food stank. It smells like earth. This is the droppings from the worms. And this is what you're going to put in your garden soils. I love this, an audience that's not shy. Fabulous. So now, this doesn't look like a lot, but this is how rich this compost material is. You only need a tablespoon for every square foot. So if you're doing a container garden and you've got pots, this is it for your standard medium-sized pot. That's it. That's all you need. So in the spring, I'll pull a wagon and I'll put all of my old soil from last year's pots in it that don't have perennials, of course. So if the perennials, I'll take the perennial out, put the soil in the wheelbarrow or the wagon, and then I'll mix this for every square foot that I've got. Mix it up real good, put it back in the pot, and then plant my new materials or my perennials from last year back in those pots, and they just thrive. So it doesn't take a lot, which is one of the upsides of vermiculture. This container lives in my laundry room, and I just add some food every week or 2 weeks. I look at it to see how it's doing, to determine if I'm feeding them enough or not. Obviously I am. I started with 4 worms. You all saw how many I have, and that was just one corner of it. And last week I gave away 100 worms to Master Garden interns that are just going through the class, so they could start their own worm farms. So they're very productive. Now, you have to be careful what you feed them. They do not like acidic foods, so steer away from your citruses. They don't do meat. It's all vegetable, fruit materials. They love coffee. They love bananas. They love cantaloupe. This banana was put in there on Tuesday, and you can see they've already started working on it. They don't like cranberries. I found this out. I didn't know, but I put these in at Thanksgiving. They're still here. So cranberries are out. Experiment with it if you're not sure. You can research it on the internet. It'll give you a good list of do's and don'ts, but it's not exhaustive. So if you have a question, try it out. If the worms don't like it, it's going to sit there. It's not going to do anything except maybe mold. If they love it, it'll be gone in a couple of weeks. Unless, of course, you have too much food for them and they can't keep up. So that's vermiculture in 5 minutes. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
If you have a shredder at home and you're shredding junk mail and checks, that come through the mail, if you're shredding at home, can you put that in a compost, or are the inks damaging?
There's two schools of thought on that. The first is you don't want to use any color at all because of the inks and the chemicals. I used some, and it doesn't seem to affect them at all. I think it's a personal preference. I would steer away from if you put any plastic through your shredder, like a card or anything like that. That would not be good for them.
And I don't know envelopes because of the glue on the
Yeah.
lips.
They do also like eggshells, though. Speaking of hard, and you would think this might cut them, but it doesn't. If you crumble it like this, they really love it, and it's a good source of calcium for them. Because again, it goes back to balance. Their droppings are your compost material, and you want it to be nutritionally balanced. So try to give them a variety. Any other questions about anything we've talked about? Y'all ready to go and start composting?
Sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Are there any city ordinances or laws or rules that we need to follow? City ordinances involved?
So I happen to work with lots and lots of cities. I have for over 20 years, and I have yet to see an ordinance regarding composting. If it's done as we've described. They will have ordinances against junk or unsanitary conditions.
Smells.
So done properly, never seen it. Homeowners associations, they may start to get into that, how you keep it, because they're concerned about appearances. But that's about the extent of it,
Thank
as
you.
long as it's sanitary.
You said you keep that in your laundry room. Do you need to keep it warm, or it just needs a dark place?
That's a great question. Do you have to keep it warm or is it just dark? It's both. I keep it in the laundry room because the temperature is pretty consistent. They don't like the cold. So if you put them outside in your garden, they're going to dig deep and you may never see them again. They need. Now I do have a friend who does, he's a certified permaculturist. So I was talking to you all earlier about system stacking. I have stuff on my finger. Will come off. That's what he does. I mean, and he's super advanced. He's got a container built around one of his trees that serves as a bench, but when you open the top of the bench, it's got vermiculture underneath it. So he'll go out, throw stuff in there, and it's well insulated, so he doesn't have to worry about them getting too cold. That is a really cool system. I don't have the space or the capability to do that, but he does. So that's another option. If you have a protected environment you can put them in your yard, you could certainly do that. But temperature is important. I think they can only take extremes from, check me on this, 60 degrees to 90 degrees. 90 might be too high. It might be 60 to 80.
So garage might not be good in
Yeah.
summertime or winter.
Right. In the extreme heats, you'll kill them.
If you have the insulated garage, I know there's a master gardener, and her garage is insulated.
Sure.
She keep her worms.
Yeah,
in
if your
the
garage is insulated, that would work out, sure. Because it keeps it pretty temperate. But they haven't been bothered in my laundry room.
Probably like the heat in there from the dryer.
So, well, thanks for coming out. I hope you learned something.
Thank you.